I guess I'm lucky. I've yet to be booed out of a pulpit, and I've only been confronted by angry protesters twice. Back in 2009, I served as a voting delegate to our denomination's National Assembly in Grand Rapids, Michigan, the 51st General Synod of the United Church of Christ. It's where the wider church conducts its business, makes resolutions for social justice action, and gathers for celebration and worship. It happens every 2 years in different places around the country. Now, being a delegate, I was assigned to lead a committee on one of these social justice resolutions. Now, some of these resolutions are pretty interesting, like the one endorsing same-sex marriage back in 2005. And some of them, frankly, are less interesting. They seem kind of obvious. As a delegate, I was assigned to the committee that was considering a resolution on economic justice. I think it was called an Economic Justice Covenant. And the basic gist was that we ought to support economic justice, which was pretty broadly defined. Hard to argue with that, right? I mean, no one would say they support economic injustice. The resolution didn't have any political leanings or any teeth, really, to be honest. I'd honestly hoped for something a little more controversial. We'd spent the whole time debating about the grammar of the document, since the issue itself was pretty straightforward. Yes, we support economic justice. Well, anyway, later in the week, my turn came up to present the findings of our committee to the wider assembly. So I'm standing up there in front of about 2,000 people, right? Just me at my podium and the moderator of the General Synod at his, a few feet to my right. And I start giving my report. Now, I'm just a few words into my presentation when I hear the faint sound of voices chanting and humming something that I can't quite make out. I pause and I search the audience before me, trying to figure out where this is coming from. And then I see this column of demonstrators snaking their way through the crowd. There's a woman leading them, and as she gets closer to the stage, I can hear her shouting, screaming, really, furiously at the top of her lungs, something about how this is a travesty and a grave injustice. Maybe some people are offended by economic justice, I thought to myself, as I wondered what to do next. I thought at the time that my band was booed off the stage at a community fundraiser back in high school. That was the other time that I was protested by an indignant crowd. But I realized pretty quickly that this demonstration at the General Synod was not directed at me personally, for which I was greatly relieved. It was a response to the preceding item on the agenda, a controversial decision about our denominational voting representation that had made some people furious. There were certain communities within the church who felt that their voice had been silenced. I stopped talking and I let this woman have her say. She was crying now, clearly pretty upset and feeling very strongly about all of this. A pastor stood up, a well-respected pastor in our denomination, a woman named Donna Scopper, and she asked the moderator if maybe we could pause the proceedings to have a word of prayer, to acknowledge the hurt that some people were feeling and to help us to heal and to move forward. Now, the moderator was pretty rattled by all of this. From my vantage point on the stage right next to him, I could see the sweat dripping down his brow. And before I tell you what happened next, you have to understand something about these meetings. At these large gatherings, Robert's Rules of Order are second only to the Bible. And it's a close second. Your request for prayer, the moderator calmly replied, is out of order. Then he looked at me and asked me to continue with my remarks. I shot him a look back that said, "You got to be joking, right?" I wish I'd said that out loud in front of everyone. To be honest, I was a little flustered myself. But I did tell him that I couldn't continue in good conscience until this matter was resolved. And he eventually allowed the gathering to say a prayer after another 10 minutes of heated debate. Sometimes the church gets these difficult moments of conflict just right. And sometimes it gets them so wrong. The clash in Grand Rapids that summer was uncomfortable and unfortunate, but relatively uneventful. No one came to blows or got physically hurt. No one got arrested. Last weekend, of course, things got a little more tense. We're probably all aware of the uproar at the UIC Pavilion in Chicago, where presidential hopeful Donald Trump was planning to speak. The event was canceled, but the story of what happened there exactly has been unclear at best, muddied by personal bias and political perspective. Some claim that the protesters who aimed to disrupt the event were peaceful, while Trump and his supporters continue to refer to them as thugs who came to pick a fight. Things got violent as supporters and protesters came to blows. And it's all intensified a heated national conversation about the nature of free speech and the acceptable boundaries of protest, and whether those protesters, however peaceful, had a right to disrupt such an event in the first place. Our text this morning deals with that very same concern. When conflict is brewing, how are we called to respond as people of faith? Political discourse has gotten pretty harsh these days. Conversations are heated, and discussions have frequently devolved into name-calling and spectacle. And everyone seems to be a little on edge, to put it mildly. Well, when Jesus arrived in Jerusalem at the beginning of the annual Passover celebration, things were even worse. The city was a powder keg, flammable, just waiting for that spark that would make the whole thing explode. Occupied by the Roman Empire for nearly 3 decades, relations between the Jewish citizenry and the occupying forces had been strained from the beginning. An uneasy peace existed between the two major religious parties, the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and the Roman authorities. They retained a Jewish king, Herod, but he was in Rome's pocket and everyone knew it. The Roman governor who pulled Herod's strings was a cruel and petty tyrant by the name of Pontius Pilate. And beneath them all, the populace was feeling increasingly bitter and resentful and oppressed. Now, you can't make an apples-to-apples comparison here to American politics, tempting as that may be, so don't even try. But that said, many of the same ingredients are there in the stew. 2 factions vying for popular support, corrupt politicians, and a growing populist movement born of dissatisfaction with all of it, who just want to see something new. Pontius Pilate was especially despised. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, who we rely on for many of our extra biblical accounts of this period, writes about him in his work, The Jewish War. He tells of how, under the cover of darkness, Pilate erected effigies of Caesar all over the city in defiance of Jewish law. When the citizens woke up the next morning to find these, they were horrified. Pilate had also apparently built an aqueduct on top of one of their most sacred monuments. The Jews protested these actions, some of them violently, some of them peacefully. But even those who demonstrated peacefully, gathering around his palace and lying down on the ground in silent protest, faced a cruel fate. According to historical record, Pilate ordered his soldiers to cut them down. The climate during this occupation was uneasy to begin with. But during Passover, these things always intensified. The Passover was a commemoration of Israel's exodus from Egypt in ancient times, their liberation from slavery and oppression. One can imagine that such festivities made the Romans very nervous. You might say that they elevated their terror threat level during this time of year, doubling down on security in the hopes of preventing a revolt. It was also customary for the Roman governor, who lived outside of the city walls, to stay in Jerusalem throughout Passover to oversee things personally and to maintain order. And so it was that Pontius Pilate, mounted on horseback and surrounded by heavily armed Roman legionnaires, paraded into Jerusalem just before the Passover from the western gate of the city. He made sure that there would be plenty of pomp and circumstance, made sure that everyone got a real good look at his soldiers and their weapons, made sure that nobody got any funny ideas. Little did Pilate know, on the other side of town, a man was riding through the eastern gate of the city from the Mount of Olives, awkwardly saddled upon a donkey. His disciples, a ragtag collection of followers that he'd picked up along the course of his travels, swarmed around him, shouting out his name. And this man, Jesus, well, he definitely had some funny ideas. Coming from opposite directions before the week was out, their trajectories would collide. Two processions, two leaders, two very different ideologies. One comes in war, the other in peace. One is ready to fight, but Jesus just wants to talk. The road to the eastern gate that Jesus passed through on Palm Sunday inclines uphill from the Kidron Valley, first down from the Mount of Olives into the valley, and then back up again into the city. Unlike Pilate, you might say that Jesus takes the proverbial high road into Jerusalem. I made a passing reference to something earlier, a vote that was taken at the United Church of Christ's General Synod back in 2005. A vote to officially support and endorse same-sex marriage across the denomination. This was a seminal moment for the UCC, and it was an action that had broad support, as you can imagine. But the endorsement was not universal or unanimous. There were some congregations who felt that this was a mistake, that we were pushing our social agenda a bridge too far. And their delegates were there to ensure that their voices were heard. Now, just before the vote was taken, our general minister and president at the time, Reverend John Thomas, stood up and made what I think was a very important speech. He named the dynamic in the room, acknowledged that, however the vote turned out, some people would be disappointed, wounded even. And given that, he discouraged applause from either side after the matter was settled. And when the resolution passed, he offered a prayer. He gave thanks for the church. He gave thanks for its diversity and the ways in which we are united, even when we don't agree. His words highlighted the beauty of the church at its best, that it's never about us and them. Just us, together in community. Naturally, there were people, whole churches even, who weren't happy with the decision to support same-sex couples and left the denomination. We lost the entire Puerto Rico conference over this. John Thomas's prayer didn't change that. It couldn't have. But it brought dignity to the proceedings, I think. It was a humble and deeply faithful response to a deeply divisive issue. Sometimes the church gets these moments of conflict so wrong. But sometimes It gets it just right. Last Palm Sunday, 1 year ago, our church began one of the hardest journeys that we've ever known. It's been a year now since we set foot upon this road, since we've begun to re-examine who we are, since everything changed. Our senior pastor wasn't here to lead us. We were confronted with uncertainty, with hard decisions, with disagreement amongst ourselves, within ourselves, even about what to think or how to feel about what we were going through. The potential for conflict was enormous. It seemed like we were a powder keg, flammable, just waiting for the spark that would make it all explode. And you better believe that when I stood in this pulpit 1 year ago, I was a little worried. But the spark never came. Or maybe it could be that we weren't all that flammable to begin with. We talked. We talked a lot. We talked in council meetings, in congregational gatherings. We talked in parking lots and at dinner tables. We talked in the confidence of pastors' offices and out in the open where everyone could hear us. We didn't shout. We didn't yell. We didn't boo people out of meetings. And yes, I'm afraid that does happen sometimes in churches. But we didn't do any of those things. We talked. We prayed together. We said things that needed to be said, and we did something else. We listened. We listened to each other. We didn't always agree. Some of us got frustrated. I think we all got frustrated at one time or another. And we lost some good people along the way. But everyone listened. You listened to each other, and you listened for the call of a God who is still speaking, still leading us, still drawing us closer to what we might yet become. In my Palm Sunday sermon last year, I asked all of you what kind of story you wanted to tell about this place, about who we are. And looking back, I think we can say that our story was honest, that it was faithful, that it wasn't the story of a pastor, but of a spiritually grounded and mature congregation. It's the story of a community, a family. On Palm Sunday, we're reminded of the choice that we all have to make time and again. We can walk in Pilate's procession, arms to the teeth, waiting for trouble. Or we can follow in Jesus' wake, coming in peace. When I read the news, see the fistfights breaking out between voters and the marathon bare-knuckle boxing match that our presidential election has become, I have to remind myself that there are other ways to make your voice heard. I have to remind myself that you don't always have to shout to be heard. When I was a little kid, we used to record lots of things on cassette tapes, at family gatherings and such. My brother and I would record little skits or, just what was going on around us. And there was one that turned up some years later that we all got a good laugh out of. We were at my grandmother's house on this tape, this recording. It was probably Thanksgiving or something, family gathering. And you could hear all the adults conversing with each other, sort of blah, 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 like something out of Peanuts. And you hear my little voice sort of come up on the tape, and it says, "Can I please have a glass of orange juice? Can I please have a glass of orange juice?" They continue talking. "Can I please have some orange juice? Can I have some orange juice, please?" And then you hear my mother's voice, and she says, Well, you don't have to yell. You don't always have to shout to make your voice heard. Maybe when you're a kid you do, but for adults there are better ways. And I've seen that. I've seen that in our church. Regardless of outcomes, I believe that you all have walked the high road. You've kept your integrity. And regardless of who leads from this pulpit, you are all already following in Jesus' wake, following in that parade, that protest against everything that would destroy us and our humanity. Keep following him. Keep following him beyond these walls into the world outside, a world that needs that kind of love. Sometimes the church gets it all wrong. But you all have shown me what it looks like when the church gets it right. Amen.